Medieval knights fought dragons, giants, and snails. Guess which one shows up most in their books? Picture this. You've spent weeks copying out a holy manuscript by hand. Hours of painstaking letters, golden illuminations, and carefully inked saints. Your back aches, your fingers are cramped. And what do you draw in the margin to lighten the mood? A knight in full armor bravely charging into battle against a snail. Yes, really. From the late 13th century onwards, medieval manuscripts across Europe are littered with these bizarre little scenes. Sometimes the knight is mounted, lance ready. Sometimes he's cowering in fear as the snail towers over him. In other cases, the snail itself is absurdly large, with its slimy head poking menacingly out of its shell like some kind of garden monster. The one thing they all share is a sense of ridiculousness. This is not St. George fighting a dragon. This is a man in expensive chainmail, terrified of a creature you can crush under your boot. And these weren't isolated doodles either. Snail-fighting knights appear in psalters, prayer books, chronicles, and even on cathedral carvings. In Lyon Cathedral, around 1310, stone panels depicted knights squaring off against snail-like beasts. Clearly, this wasn't just one bored scribe's private joke. It spread across regions and lasted for centuries. Which brings us to the obvious question, why? Why snails? Why knights? And why this weird matchup over and over again? Early theories lean toward the simplest answer. Humor. After all, medieval scribes were known pranksters. Marginalia, those little doodles in the edges of manuscripts, are filled with bawdy jokes, killer rabbits, farting priests, and other things that have nothing to do with the solemn text they accompany. So maybe knights fighting snails was just another absurd gag to keep monks entertained during long nights of copying. A medieval meme, if you will, but the sheer repetition of the snail motif suggests there might be more to it. These weren't just one-off jokes, they were everywhere. That hints at some shared cultural meaning, some symbol that medieval audiences instantly understood, even if it's lost on us today. The snail, after all, isn't just a slimy creature, it's slow, fragile, and easily overlooked. Pairing it against the heavily armed knight creates a visual contrast that begs to be explained. Was it satire, symbolism, or simply silliness? Historians have been puzzling over that for decades, and in the next section we'll explore the deeper interpretations. But for now, just imagine the scene. The mighty knight, the proud defender of Christendom, facing down a snail. If nothing else, it proves that medieval people had a wicked sense of humor, and weren't above mocking their own heroes in the margins of history. So, we've established that knights battling snails was not a one-off doodle. It was practically a genre. Which raises the bigger question, what were these snails supposed to mean? Surely they weren't just a running joke about garden pests. One of the most common interpretations is that the snail represented the weak overcoming the strong. Think about it. A tiny, slow, fragile creature facing a fully armed knight. The contrast is ridiculous, but also symbolic. Some scholars argue that the snail was meant to embody cowardice, humility, or even the common peasant, while the knight, with all his pomp and steel, looks absurd for taking it so seriously. It's a subtle way of mocking the elite without actually writing knights are idiots in the manuscript. Another theory points to the Lombards, a group of bankers and moneylenders who were widely disliked in medieval Europe. They were accused of greed, usury, and treachery, and artists often needed a coded way to depict them without getting into political trouble. According to art historian Lillian Randall, the snail became a stand-in for these unpopular figures, and the knight versus snail scene symbolized the righteous defeating the corrupt. If that's true, then every doodle of a knight stabbing a snail was also a little propaganda cartoon. There's also a religious angle. In Psalm 58 there's a line about the wicked. Like a snail that melteth away into slime, they shall be taken away. Some scholars suggest that these drawings were moral allegories, visual reminders of the fate of sinners. The snail, slow, slimy, and doomed, was a handy image of sin itself. The knight, then, wasn't just fighting a mollusk. He was fighting corruption, temptation, maybe even the devil disguised as something pitiful. And then there's the more philosophical take. Snails as symbols of time and death. They creep slowly forward, inevitable, unstoppable. A knight can swing a sword all day, but he can't kill time. In that sense, the snail might have been a grim little reminder tucked into the margins. No matter how mighty you are, the snail always wins in the end. Of course, these theories aren't mutually exclusive. Medieval art loved layers of meaning, and a snail could be cowardice in one manuscript, sin in another, and satire in the next. The beauty and frustration is that the artists never left us a guidebook. They just kept drawing these ridiculous duels, leaving modern historians to scratch their heads. But whether it was mocking knights, condemning moneylenders, or illustrating biblical slime metaphors, one thing's certain. The snail wasn't just a doodle, it was a symbol with bite, or at least with a shell. Let's be honest, sometimes a snail is just a snail. Not every doodle in the margins of a medieval manuscript was a grand allegory or coded political commentary. A lot of the time, it was just funny. And medieval people loved a good laugh. The margins of illuminated manuscripts are filled with what we might call medieval memes. Rabbits armed with swords chasing hunters, monkeys dressed as priests, people mooning each other, even nuns harvesting phallic-looking vegetables. Yes, that really happened. It was chaotic, cheeky, and definitely not the solemn, dour Middle Ages we imagine. In that world of bizarre doodles, knights fighting snails fit right in. Imagine you're a scribe, hunched over your desk, painstakingly copying a prayer book for months on end. You need a break, so you add a little joke in the margin, a brave knight terrified of a slow-moving snail. It's a visual punchline, a bit of comic relief in between Psalms and Gospels, but there's another layer to it, mocking the knights themselves. Knights love to see themselves as noble defenders of Christendom riding into glorious battle, but to a monk sitting in a scriptorium, they were just noisy brutes who drank too much and demanded tithes. What better way to cut them down to size than to show a proud knight flinching at a snail? It's satire, disguised as silliness. There's also the idea of inside jokes. Medieval manuscript workshops were often collaborative. One scribe might draw a knight, and the next one might add a snail just to mess with him. Over time, the motif became a shared gag, passed around, repeated, exaggerated. The fact that it kept popping up for over a century suggests it became something of a tradition, almost like a recurring character in a cartoon strip. And while we laugh at these drawings today, medieval audiences laugh too. These books weren't just for private devotion. They were often read aloud or displayed to wealthy patrons. Spotting a knight battling a snail in the corner was like finding an Easter egg in a Marvel movie. It was a wink, a reminder that even in the most sacred of texts, there was room for humor. So while historians argue about symbolism, it's worth remembering medieval people weren't humorless drones. They cracked jokes, they poked fun at authority, and yes, they thought the idea of a knight dueling a snail was hilarious. In other words, the Middle Ages had memes, and the snail was one of their greatest hits. So, What became of the snail? Did this bizarre trend just fizzle out, or did it leave a lasting mark on medieval culture? The answer is a bit of both. By the late 15th century, snail fighting nights began to fade from manuscript margins. Printing presses were replacing hand-illuminated books, and with them went the tradition of scribes sneaking jokes into the corners. But the snail didn't disappear entirely. In fact, its stubborn little shell managed to crawl its way into other places, like stone carvings on cathedrals where knights still squared off against spiraled adversaries. Lyme Cathedral's panels from around 1310 are a perfect example. Knights locked in eternal battle with monstrous snail hybrids. Imagine going to church and seeing that on your way in. Hard to keep a straight face. Why did the image last so long? Probably because it worked on multiple levels. On the surface, it was funny. Everyone could laugh at the mighty knight humbled by a garden pest. But underneath, it could be read as satire, moral lesson, or political jab. That flexibility gave it staying power. Long after the original joke was explained, people kept repeating the motif because it still felt clever. Today, historians still argue about what the snails meant, which, ironically, might be their greatest legacy. The artists never told us, and maybe they never intended to. Sometimes a joke is funniest when it doesn't have a neat explanation. That mystery, the fact that we're still debating it 700 years later, proves just how effective these doodles were. They weren't just filler, they were culture, commentary, and comedy all rolled into one slimy package. And perhaps the biggest takeaway is this: the Middle Ages weren't as grim and humorless as we often think. These little snail battles remind us that medieval people had sarcasm, irony, and inside jokes just like we do. Their humor might look strange to us now, but the spirit behind it, the need to laugh at authority, to mock our own heroes, to find silliness in the serious, hasn't changed a bit. So the next time you're scrolling through memes on your phone, remember, monks in the 14th century were doing the same thing, just with ink and parchment. And for them, the ultimate meme was a knight in full armor, sword raised high, squaring off against the deadliest opponent of all, a snail.